He almost didn't stop. The street was loud, the crowd was moving, and he was already late. But then he saw her, a woman on the ground bags scattered across the sidewalk, people stepping around her like she was just another obstacle. Nobody slowed down. Nobody looked twice. Daniel went back. He helped her to her feet, gathered what he could, and handed her bag over without a word. It took less than a minute. He turned to leave. That was when she said it. "Daniel." He stopped cold. He had never told her his name. Daniel Brooks lived the way most people in Chicago lived, head down, moving fast, trying not to think too far ahead. He was 34 years old, worked freelance repair jobs, plumbing, electrical, drywall, whatever anyone would pay him to fix, and he had been doing it this way for 2 years. Not alone the way bachelors are alone. Alone the way a man is alone when the person who made the house feel like home is gone, and everything left behind still carries her shape. His daughter Sophie was 8 years old and understood more than he gave her credit for. She had her mother's way of going quiet at the exact moment when most kids would get loud. She asked questions that didn't have easy answers, and she asked them at breakfast, which was the worst possible time when Daniel was still barely awake and already behind on whatever the day needed from him. That Tuesday morning started the way most mornings did. Daniel was on the phone before the coffee finished brewing, following up on a job inquiry he'd sent the week before. He stood at the counter with his back to the table, voice low and professional, trying to sound like someone who had everything under control. Sophie sat at the kitchen table behind him, eating her toast quietly, not asking for anything, not complaining, just eating and watching the window, the way she did when she had something on her mind, but wasn't ready to say it yet. By the time the call ended with nothing definite, she had finished eating and gone to rinse her plate. Her backpack was already sitting by the front door. Daniel reached for his own toast and found she had left him the better piece, the one that had browned evenly on both sides, the one with more butter. She hadn't said anything about it. She had just done it and moved on like it cost her nothing to be that kind. He stood there for a moment, holding it, not eating, not quite knowing what to do with the feeling it gave him. Sophie appeared in the doorway with her backpack on, looking at him with that careful expression she'd had since she was small, like she was trying to read something written in small print. "Do you still think about Mom?" she asked. She wasn't trying to upset him. She never was. She was 8 and still working out what loss meant in practical terms, whether the missing ever faded, whether it was supposed to what a person was allowed to feel 2 years on. She asked the question with the same directness she used to ask whether it would rain or whether they could have pancakes on Saturday. Daniel said, "Yeah, I do." And because he had nothing better to give her, he added, "We should get going." Sophie nodded and headed for the door without pushing for more. She accepted what he gave her and moved on. He watched her go and thought not for the first time that she was handling all of this better than he was. He dropped her at school and took the train toward the north side, where a property manager had called about a boiler that needed looking at. The train was standing room only. Nobody made eye contact. A man 2 seats down had his earbuds in loud enough that the tinny sound bled into the car for the entire ride. That was the city on a Tuesday morning, everyone inside their own radius, moving through the same space without ever really touching it. Daniel got off 2 stops early and walked the last stretch the way he usually did when he needed a few minutes to think through a job before arriving at it. The sidewalk was crowded, a delivery cart blocking the corner, a food truck double parked near a coffee shop. Clusters of people stopped mid-path looking at their phones. He moved through it without thinking, his mind already running through the likely causes of a failing boiler in a building that old. He almost walked right past her. She was on the ground, near a crosswalk, a woman somewhere around 60, with gray-streaked hair, pulled back, wearing a practical coat that had gone gray at the elbows. A heavy canvas tote bag had split open when she fell, scattering its contents across a wide stretch of sidewalk, a water bottle still rolling toward the curb, a manila folder that had come open and was losing pages to the wind. A small pharmacy bag, a set of keys, loose papers, getting stepped on by people who didn't look down. The woman was on one knee, reaching for things that kept moving away from her. Nobody around her slowed. A man in a dark coat stepped directly over her bag without breaking stride. Daniel stopped walking. He stood there for just a second, long enough to confirm that no one else was going to turn back, and then he did. He crouched down beside her and asked if she was okay. She said she thought so, just her knee, probably nothing serious. Her voice was calm, a little embarrassed, like she was more bothered by being seen on the ground than by the fall itself. He helped her to her feet carefully, one hand under her elbow, and once she was steady, he started gathering what had scattered. Some of the papers had slid all the way under a nearby bench. One had been stepped on and torn at the corner. He collected everything he could find, folded the split bag closed so she could hold it against her body, and handed it back to her. She thanked him. He said it was no problem. He straightened up, checked the time on his phone out of reflex, and turned to leave. Daniel. Her voice was quiet, but certain, not a question, not a guess, not the way strangers accidentally use a common name. He turned back around. She was standing steadier now, holding the bag with both hands pressed against her coat, looking directly at him. Her expression was focused in a way that had nothing to do with the fall. It was the expression of someone who had finally found the thing they had been looking for, and was now choosing their words carefully. He hadn't introduced himself. He hadn't said his name, hadn't mentioned his work, hadn't handed her a card. He had crouched down on a public sidewalk and helped a stranger pick up her things, and he had been in the middle of walking away. He was nobody to her. He should have been nobody to her. "Wait," she said. He looked at her carefully, searching her face for something familiar. Nothing came. He was certain he had never seen her before. "How do you know my name?" he asked. The woman met his eyes without flinching. "My name is Margaret Hayes," she said. "And I've been trying to find you for a long time." The crowd kept moving around them. A bus groaned past the curb. Someone's phone rang and went to voicemail. The whole city continued its business like nothing had happened. And Daniel stood on the sidewalk, looking at this woman, Margaret Hayes, trying to figure out what exactly he was supposed to do with what she had just said. His first instinct was to walk away. He recognized that instinct. He had used it a lot in the past 2 years, that particular reflex that looked like reasonableness, but was really just protection. Someone says something you're not ready for, and the body knows before the mind does put distance between yourself and whatever that is. He had gotten very good at it. But she had said his name. She had known it without being told. And now she was standing there with both hands still pressed against that split canvas bag, waiting, not chasing him, not explaining herself in a rush, just waiting like she had waited before, and was willing to wait a little longer. "How do you know who I am?" he asked again. Margaret held his gaze steadily. "I knew your wife," she said. He didn't leave. That surprised him. He had expected himself to leave. Instead, he found himself standing at a corner table inside a diner, 2 blocks down across from this woman he did not recognize, with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him. Margaret had a glass of water. She hadn't ordered anything else. She seemed like someone who had learned not to ask for more than she needed. She had said she'd explain everything if he gave her 10 minutes. He'd told her he had a job to get to. She said she understood. He sat down anyway. "Your wife's name was Claire," Margaret said. "She was treated at Northwestern Memorial, oncology floor, 4th floor east. She was there for the last 6 weeks." Daniel's jaw tightened. He knew those details. He did not need them recited back to him, but he also didn't stop her, because something in the way she said the name Claire, plainly without drama, told him she wasn't performing grief. She was just telling him what she knew. "You were there every day," Margaret continued. "Almost every day. You'd come after 5, sometimes earlier if you could get away. You always brought coffee in a blue travel mug. You usually left around 10 or 11 at night." She looked at the table for a moment, before looking back at him. "I worked that floor. I was one of her nurses." Daniel set his cup down. The tile floor hummed with the ambient noise of the diner. Someone behind him was laughing at something on their phone. "I don't remember you," he said. "I know," Margaret said. "That's okay." It wasn't a rebuke. It wasn't even disappointment. She said it the way you accept weather, something that simply is without requiring an argument. And that made it worse, somehow, because it meant she had already accounted for this, had already sat with the fact that she had been present for something enormous in his life, and he had moved through those 6 weeks without ever really seeing her. He started. "You were with her," Margaret said. "That's where you were. That's where you should have been." He didn't know what to do with that either, so he picked up the coffee and drank some of it, even though it was cold. Margaret looked at him with an expression that wasn't pity he would have left immediately, if it were pity. It was something more like recognition. The way one person looks at another when they already know which parts of the story hurt them most because they've carried a version of it themselves. "I need to tell you something about why I was looking for you," she said. "Not just because of Claire. Because of what she asked me." Daniel's eyes moved to her face. "But before that," Margaret said, "I want to tell you about my husband." He hadn't expected that. He waited. "His name was Robert. He died when I was 31. Heart attack, no warning, no let-up, nothing. We had 2 kids. Our youngest was 3 years old." She turned the glass of water slowly on the table. "I kept working because I had to. And I kept going because I didn't know what else to do. But for a long time, going through the motions was all it was. I was present in the physical sense and somewhere else in every way that mattered." She said all of this without asking him to feel sorry for her. She was building towards something, and he could sense it, and he stayed quiet. "Your wife was my patient," Margaret said, "but she talked to me like I was a person. Not everyone does that. Most patients, and I don't say this with any bitterness, most patients are too sick to think much about the nurses, which is understandable. But Claire was different. She'd ask how my shift was going. She'd remember things I mentioned from earlier in the week. One afternoon, she asked me about Robert." Margaret's expression shifted slightly. Not grief exactly, but the particular weight of being genuinely seen by someone who is running out of time. "She was the first person in years who asked me, just asked out of nowhere. 'What about you? How are you holding up?'" Daniel looked at his hands on the table. "She didn't have to do that," Margaret said. "She was the one who was sick. But that was who she was, and I think you know that better than anyone." He did know it. That was the thing. He knew it so completely that hearing it from a stranger made the whole diner feel slightly unreal, like the walls had shifted an inch in every direction. Claire had done that their entire life together, noticed the person standing just outside the center of the moment, the one nobody else was looking at, and turned toward them. She had done it at parties, at family dinners, at the grocery store. He used to tease her about it. He had loved it about her. He hadn't thought about that specific quality of hers in months. He'd been too busy keeping the lights on and Sophie fed and himself functional enough to do both. After she passed, Margaret said carefully, "I kept thinking about what she had asked me to do. I want to be honest with you. I didn't know if I'd ever actually do it. I had your last name, and I knew the general neighborhood from something she'd mentioned once." She set her glass down. "I'd been walking through that neighborhood on several mornings before today, trying to work up the nerve to look harder. I'd almost given up. And then this morning I spotted you half a block ahead, and I was still trying to decide whether to say anything when I caught my foot on the curb." "You were looking for me," Daniel said. "On the street today. You didn't just happen to fall." "I fell because I was distracted," Margaret said. "I'd seen you, and I was trying to decide whether to say something. That part was real." A brief expression crossed her face, something between embarrassment and relief. The fall was not part of the plan. Daniel leaned back in his chair. He believed her. He wasn't sure why he believed her, but he did, maybe because the whole thing was too strange and too specific to be a lie, or maybe because some part of him had already decided, standing on that sidewalk, that walking away wasn't the right answer this time. "What did she ask you to do?" he said. Margaret reached into the canvas bag beside her, carefully given the torn strap, and placed a small envelope on the table between them. It was ivory-colored, slightly worn. At the corners, the paper softened from being handled and stored and carried. The handwriting on the front read, "For Daniel and Sophie when the time is right." He recognized the handwriting before he could prepare himself for it. The particular slant of the letters, the way she always pressed a little harder on the downstrokes. He had seen it on grocery lists and birthday cards and notes left on the kitchen counter for 2 years before she got sick. His throat closed around something he didn't have a name for. "She asked me to find you," Margaret said quietly. "She said she didn't know when. She didn't know if you'd be ready or if I'd ever actually manage to track you down. But she wanted someone to check on you, not to fix anything, not to tell you what to do." She let a moment settle before continuing. She said, and I'm going to try to say this the way she said it. She said, he's going to try to carry all of it by himself, and he's strong enough to do it for a while. But please just remind him that he doesn't have to. The diner kept going around him. A waitress called out an order number at the counter. The door opened, and a cold draft moved through the room. Daniel sat very still, both hands flat on the table, looking at the envelope and not picking it up. He had spent 2 years building a life that worked on the outside. He went where he needed to go. He paid what needed to be paid. He showed up for Sophie in all the ways he could measure meals, school drop-offs, homework, lights out at a reasonable hour. He had told himself that was enough. He had almost convinced himself it was true. But Sophie had asked him that morning quietly over toast whether he still thought about her mother. And he had said yes and moved on, because moving on was the only thing he knew how to do. He hadn't asked Sophie what she thought about. He hadn't asked whether she was doing okay in the ways that couldn't be measured. He had given her the functional version of a father and told himself it was the best he had. The letter on the table said something different. It said that Claire had seen this coming, that she had known him well enough to know exactly which way he would fail, not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, quietly, by trying to be everything alone and letting the weight of it hollow him out from the inside. He picked up the envelope. He didn't open it. Not there. That felt like something that needed to happen somewhere private, somewhere he wasn't sitting across from a stranger in a diner on a Tuesday morning. But he held it, and he felt the particular weight of paper that had been kept carefully for a long time. "She trusted you," Daniel said. It came out low, more to himself than to her. "She trusted both of us," Margaret said. "She trusted that I'd find you. And she trusted that when I did, you'd still be someone who could hear this." Daniel looked up at her. The guilt was there. It had been building since she said Claire's name, and it was sitting in his chest now, like something with real mass. Guilt for the grief he hadn't moved through, for the distance he'd kept between himself and everything that hurt, for the mornings Sophie sat across from him at the table eating quietly, while he stood on the phone trying to hold the practical pieces together for every time he'd said, "We're fine," without believing it. But underneath the guilt, something else was also moving, something smaller and harder to name, like a window opening in a room that had been shut for too long. Before he stood to leave, he asked if he could have her number. Margaret wrote it on the back of a paper napkin and slid it across the table without making anything of it. He folded it once and put it in his jacket pocket. He got home after 9 that night. The boiler job had taken longer than expected. It always did. And by the time he picked up Sophie from the neighbor's place and got her fed and through her bedtime routine, the apartment was quiet in that particular way it got after she fell asleep. Not peaceful exactly, just still. the kind of still that had no buffer in it. Daniel set the envelope on the kitchen table and stood at the counter for a long moment, without turning the lights on. The street light outside pushed a thin yellow bar through the window blinds and laid it across the table, across the envelope, across the grain of the wood. He looked at the handwriting on the front. For Daniel and Sophie, when the time is right. And then he looked away at the wall at the dark window above the sink. He saw the toast then. Sophie's toast from that morning, the better piece, the one she had buttered and set aside for him. It was still there on the small plate, wrapped in a piece of plastic wrap she must have found and pressed around it carefully before she left for school. 8 years old, and she had wrapped it up so it wouldn't go stale. She had done it without being asked, without leaving a note, without making anything of it at all. Daniel sat down at the table. He didn't reach for the envelope right away. He sat with the toast and the dark kitchen and the quiet. And he let himself feel the weight of the day in full for the first time since he'd walked out of that diner. He opened the envelope. The letter was 2 pages handwritten, the paper thin enough that the light from outside showed through it slightly. Claire's handwriting, that same familiar pressure on the downstrokes, the letters slightly forward-leaning, the way she always left a little extra space between paragraphs, like she was giving the words room to breathe. He had not seen her handwriting in 2 years. He sat with that fact for a moment before he started to read. She didn't open with an apology or a goodbye. That would have been someone else. She opened by telling him she had been watching him sleep in the chair beside her bed the night before. She wrote this and that he looked exhausted, and that even exhausted he looked like himself, and that she wanted him to know she noticed. She said the nurses had been kind, and that one of them, Margaret, had sat with her the previous afternoon when it was slow, and they had talked for almost an hour. And she had asked Margaret to do this if she ever could. Then she wrote the part that broke him open. I know what you're going to do when I'm gone. You're going to hold it all together. You're going to make sure Sophie has what she needs, and the bills are paid, and the lights stay on. And you're going to do it by gripping everything so tight that you forget to let anything in. You've always been that way, not because you're closed off, but because you love people so much that losing them makes you feel like you have to earn the right to keep going. I want you to hear me say this, even if it takes a while for it to land. You don't have to earn it. You already have it. You have always had it. Sophie needs her father, not the version of you that keeps everything running, the version that's actually there. I think you know the difference. I think you've always known. Please let someone help you. I'm not there to do it, but someone will show up. They always do for people like you, because you're the kind of person who shows up for them first. Let them. Daniel set the letter face down on the table, not because he was done with it, because he needed a moment between paragraphs, between sentences, between the words, and whatever they were asking him to do. He thought about the morning, Sophie at the table eating by herself while he stood at the counter, with his back to her phone pressed to his ear, talking to someone about a job that hadn't even come through. He thought about how many mornings had looked like that. He tried to count them, and stopped because the number was too large and too uncomfortable to hold all at once. He thought about the question she had asked him, "Do you still think about Mom?" and how he had answered it. Like a task to be completed? I do. We should get going. And moved on. Because moving on was the mechanism he had built and refined and maintained for 2 years. Because if he stopped moving, he didn't know what would happen, and he had been afraid for a very long time of finding out. The envelope was still on the table. The toast was still wrapped in its careful plastic. Outside, the city made its low, continuous sound traffic wind the distant clatter of a delivery truck. Daniel pressed both hands flat against the table and breathed. He almost talked himself out of it. The thought arrived the way those thoughts do, reasonable sounding familiar, wrapped in the voice he used when he was being practical with himself. This is too much. You don't know this woman. Whatever Claire wanted, that was 2 years ago. The situation is different. Now you've been managing fine. The thought had a kind of gravitational pull to it. the same pull that had kept him in the same radius for 2 years, functional and contained and steadily, quietly diminishing. He looked at the plastic-wrapped toast. Sophie had not wrapped it up because she needed to. She had wrapped it up because she was the kind of person who thought about whether things would still be good by the time someone got to them. She had learned that from somewhere. He knew exactly where she had learned it from. He picked up the letter and read the last paragraph. "You're a good man, Daniel. You were a good husband. You are a good father. None of those things stopped being true because I stopped being here. Don't let the grief convince you otherwise. It's going to try." He sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time after that. He didn't sleep. He didn't turn the lights on. He just sat with all of it. The guilt and the exhaustion and the grief he had been outrunning for 2 years, and let it be exactly as heavy as it was, not fighting it, not filing it away, just sitting with it until the weight began to feel like something he could carry rather than something he had to escape. At some point, the city got quieter. At some point, he heard Sophie turn over in her room, the small sound of her blanket shifting. He got up, checked on her. She was asleep, one arm flung out to the side, mouth slightly open, and he stood in her doorway for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he went back to the kitchen, turned on the small light above the stove, and ate the toast. He called Margaret on Thursday morning, using the number she had written on the napkin at the diner. He dropped Sophie at school and was standing on the corner outside, with nothing in his hand, for once no job to rush toward, no call to make. He dialed before he could think his way out of it. He told her he'd read the letter. He told her he wanted to talk. Margaret said she could meet him that afternoon, same diner, if that worked for him, and he said yes. She was already there when he arrived. She had coffee this time. "There's a position at Northwestern Memorial," she said, once they had gotten past the opening. "Facilities and maintenance. They're short-staffed. I know someone on the operations side. We've stayed in touch over the years, and she trusts my judgment." Margaret held the coffee mug with both hands. "It's stable work, benefits, regular hours, which matters when you have a kid in school." Daniel looked at the table. "That's the hospital where Claire was." "Yes," Margaret said. "It is." He turned this over. It wasn't the job itself that gave him trouble. He'd done facilities work before, knew the type of labor involved, could do it well. It was the building. Was the 4th floor east. It was the particular quality of light in hospital corridors at 5 in the morning and 11 at night, the smell of the place, the elevator that opened onto the oncology wing, the chair beside a specific bed that he had sat in so many times that the shape of it was still somewhere in his body. He said, "I don't know if I can walk in there every day." "You don't have to love it right away," Margaret said. "You don't have to feel good about it. You just have to walk in." He looked at her. "That's all it is," she said. "The first time you just walk in, everything else comes after." Daniel sat with that for a moment. It was such a simple thing to say, and such a hard thing to hear, because it removed every reason to wait. There was no threshold of readiness to reach. There was only the door and the step through it, and whatever came next. "Okay," he said. Margaret's expression didn't change dramatically. She nodded once, the way people do when something they've been holding carefully finally lands where it was supposed to. "I'll make the call today," she said. "They'll want to meet you early next week." 3 weeks later, Daniel came out of the bedroom in his work uniform, dark pants, a gray collared shirt with the hospital's name on the chest, and found Sophie in the hallway with her backpack on, ready for school, looking at him with that careful reading expression she had. She crossed the hallway and put her arms around him. He held her one hand at the back of her head, the way he had when she was smaller, and she pressed her face against his shoulder for a moment before stepping back. "You look different," she said. "Different how?" Daniel asked. Sophie considered the question with the seriousness she gave to questions that actually mattered. "Like you're more here," she said. Like you're not just in the room. Like you're actually here. He didn't have an answer that would fit into the time they had before school. So he just said, "Come on," and held the door open for her, and she walked through it, and he followed. The hospital was 12 minutes from the apartment by train. He knew that because he had made the trip many times before, always in the direction of grief, always arriving with his chest pulled tight and his hands not quite steady. This time he stood on the platform with a thermos of coffee and his work ID clipped to his shirt, and the train came and he got on. He stood outside the main entrance for less than a minute. Not stalling, just standing the way you stand, before something that holds a lot of history giving it its due. The building was the same. The glass doors, the wide entrance, the sounds that drifted out whenever someone walked through. It was the same, and he was different, or maybe not different exactly, but aware in a way he hadn't let himself be in a long time of what he was carrying and what he was choosing. It was not the absence of pain. It was not the end of anything that had happened. It was something smaller and more honest than that. It was a Tuesday morning. It was a door. It was the fact that Claire had known him well enough to send someone to find him, and that Margaret had been patient enough to show up, and that Sophie had wrapped a piece of toast in plastic and left it for him because she was 8 years old and already understood that the people you love deserve to find things still good when they finally get to them. He walked in. Some acts of kindness are small enough to forget by the end of the day, and some of them travel further than you'd ever expect, carried forward by the people who received them, finding their way to someone who needed them years later in a form you never could have planned. Sometimes, what comes back to save you is something you gave away a long time ago without thinking, without keeping track. Sometimes the past returns, not to remind you of what you lost, but to hand you something you didn't know you were still allowed to have.